The beginning. If someone had told me that an ordinary day would change the rest of my life, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But that's the funny thing about life. It has a way of turning on you when you least expect it. I wasn't looking for anything special that day. In fact, it was one of those cold, bleak winter evenings when all you want is to get home and hide under a blanket. The city streets were slick with ice, and every breath hung in the air like fog. The wind was biting, and I remember pulling my coat tighter around me, wishing I had stayed in. But I didn't. It was late December, just a few days after Christmas. I ducked into this little coffee shop on the corner of 9th Street, not because I needed the caffeine, but because I needed to feel my fingers again. My hands were frozen, and I was desperate for warmth. The place was almost empty, save for a couple in the back whispering to each other and a woman sitting by herself near the window, lost in her book. The steam from her mug curled upward in lazy tendrils, and the soft light from the street lamps outside framed her like some kind of portrait. There was something about her that drew my attention immediately. Maybe it was the way her dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, or maybe it was the quiet intensity on her face as she read, as if the rest of the world had faded away. I stood there for a moment trying to decide if I should even approach her. She seemed so engrossed in whatever she was reading, so peaceful. But something, call it curiosity or maybe just sheer loneliness, pushed me forward. I walked up to her table, my heart thudding in my chest like a teenager with his first crush. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. She looked up from her book, and for a split second, I thought she might tell me to get lost. But then she smiled. And damn, that smile. It was one of those smiles that made you forget where you were, that made everything else around you fade into the background. "No, it's not. Feel free," she said, her voice soft but clear. There was a kindness in her eyes, something that made me feel like I had made the right choice in approaching her. I sat down, not entirely sure what I was doing, but feeling like I had to stay. We started talking, small talk at first, about the weather, the cold, the usual stuff. But before long, it turned into something deeper. Her name was Emily, and she was a few years older than me. 33, she told me, while I had just turned 31. She worked in marketing, though she said it like it was nothing special. Just another job in a world full of them. But when she talked about her passions, traveling, photography, and a desire to find something more meaningful in life, her eyes lit up. There was this energy about her, something vibrant, something magnetic, and I was pulled in without even realizing it. We must have talked for hours. Time seemed to slip away as we sat in that tiny coffee shop, our words filling the space between us. She was so easy to talk to, like I had known her for years instead of just a few minutes. I told her about my job, about how I worked in finance but dreamed of doing something more creative, like writing or starting my own business. She listened intently, asking questions that made me feel like my words mattered. She seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, and that was something I hadn't felt in a long time. As we talked, I noticed little things about her. How she would bite her lip when she was thinking, how she'd absent-mindedly twirl a strand of her hair around her finger when she was deep in thought. There was something so captivating about her, something that made me want to know more, to peel back the layers and understand who she really was. At one point, she looked down at her watch and let out a small gasp. "I didn't realize it was this late," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. "I should probably get going." I nodded, though part of me didn't want her to leave. "Yeah, me too. But this was nice. I don't usually do this," I admitted, feeling a little awkward as I stood up from the table. She smiled again, that same smile that had pulled me in from the start. "I don't either," she said softly, gathering her things. There was a moment of hesitation before she spoke again. "But maybe we could do it again sometime?" I felt my heart skip a beat. "Yeah, I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, and just like that, she was gone, slipping out into the cold night with a wave and a promise to talk soon. I watched her walk away, wondering if this was the start of something, or if it was just one of those random encounters that fades into nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Over the next few weeks, we started seeing each other regularly. At first, it was casual, grabbing a drink after work, meeting up for lunch on weekends, but it didn't take long for things to get more serious. Emily had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, like nothing else mattered when we were together. We laughed a lot, talked about everything and nothing, and it felt easy, like slipping into an old routine. I met her friends and she met mine. They all seemed to love her, and how could they not? She was funny, smart, and had this confidence that made people gravitate toward her. My friends even joked that I'd hit the jackpot, that Emily was the kind of woman you didn't let go of once you had her. And for a while I believed them. We fell into a rhythm and it felt good. Really good. I could feel myself falling for her more with each passing day, and it terrified me. I hadn't been in a serious relationship in a long time, and the idea of letting someone in again scared the hell out of me. But with Emily it was different. She had a way of making me feel safe, like I could trust her with all the parts of myself I usually kept hidden. Before I knew it, months had passed, and we were inseparable. I found myself daydreaming about our future, about the places we'd travel to, the home we'd build together, the life we'd create. It all seemed so clear, so certain. Emily wasn't just a passing fling. She was the real deal, and I could see forever with her. It's funny how life can feel so perfect, so certain, and then in the blink of an eye, everything changes. But back then, I didn't know that. All I knew was that I had found someone who made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Someone who made me believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was finally falling into place. But if I'd known what was coming, maybe I wouldn't have let myself fall so hard. The wedding and new beginnings. After that first winter, time moved fast. Too fast, honestly. I guess that's how it goes when you meet someone who turns your whole world upside down. With Emily, everything felt like it was on a different timeline. It wasn't long before our casual dates turned into something more serious. Within a year of meeting, we were already talking about living together. By then, it wasn't even a question of if, but when. She moved in with me first. My place was a little bigger and, well, I liked having the control of space. She laughed about it, called me a creature of habit. But the truth was I'd lived alone for so long that sharing my space felt like a big deal. And yet, it was the easiest decision I ever made. Felt right. Emily fit into my life like she was meant to be there all along. Looking back, everything moved so seamlessly between us that I didn't stop to question anything. We both had our routines, work during the week, lazy mornings in bed on weekends, planning spontaneous trips to the mountains or the beach. She was always up for an adventure, always the one pulling me out of my comfort zone. We found a rhythm, one that made me feel like I had finally found the partner I'd been searching for. But then came the next big step, marriage. It didn't take long for the topic to come up. I think we both knew it was inevitable. We joke about it at first, Emily casually tossing out ideas about what her dream wedding would look like. She had this vision in her head, something simple but elegant, with just our closest friends and family. "I don't need anything fancy," she would say with a smile. "I just want us, and the people who matter most." I loved that about her. She never needed grand gestures or over-the-top displays of affection. What mattered to her was the connection between us, the simple moments that made up our life together. So, when I decided to propose, I didn't go for anything elaborate. I kept it small, intimate, just the two of us. It was a warm evening in late spring, one of those nights when the air is soft and the world feels a little lighter. We had spent the day hiking one of our favorite trails, taking in the views and laughing about nothing in particular. When we reached the top of the hill, with the sun setting behind us, I pulled her close and told her how much she meant to me, how my life had changed since the day I met her in that little coffee shop. And then, without any grand speech or rehearsed lines, I pulled out the ring. Her reaction was instant. Tears, laughter, disbelief. She looked at me like I was the only person in the world, and for a moment I felt like I was. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to get the words out through her smile. Of course, yes. It wasn't the grand proposal you see in movies, but it was perfect for us. It was real, just like everything else between us had been from the start. From there, the wedding planning moved fast. We weren't the type to drag things out. Emily was efficient when she set her mind to something, and I was more than happy to let her take the lead on planning. We agreed on a small ceremony just like she wanted, with a few close friends and family. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would break the bank, just a day that would be about us and our commitment to each other. The day itself was beautiful. It was early autumn, and the leaves had just started to turn. We chose a quiet vineyard just outside of town, a place we had visited once on a weekend getaway. It was serene, with rolling hills and rows of vines stretching as far as the eye could see. The setting sun bathed everything in a golden light, making it feel like we were in some kind of dream. Emily looked stunning that day. She had chosen a simple, flowing white dress that made her look like she was walking on air. Her hair was pinned up with a few loose curls falling around her face, and she wore this radiant smile that lit up the entire day. I stood at the altar, watching her walk toward me, and I swear my heart stopped for a moment. It was surreal, everything about it. It felt like the culmination of everything we had been building, all the late-night talks, the laughter, the adventures. And here we were, finally saying our vows, making promises we fully believed we could keep. The ceremony was short, just like we wanted it. A few heartfelt words, our vows exchanged under a canopy of trees, and before I knew it, the officiant was telling us to kiss. I pulled her close, kissed her like I had 1,000 times before, but this time, it felt different. It felt like the beginning of something new, something solid and lasting. The reception was just as intimate. We had rented out a small barn on the vineyard, decorated it with string lights and simple floral arrangements. Our families mingled, our friends laughed and danced, and for a few hours, it felt like we were the center of the universe. Emily was radiant, moving through the room with that effortless charm that made people gravitate toward her. She made sure everyone felt included, everyone was having a good time. She had that rare ability to make people feel special, and that night, she was in her element. At one point, we sneaked away from the party, just the two of us, and stood outside under the stars. The cool night air was a relief from the warmth of the barn, and we stood there for a moment, taking it all in. "We did it," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "We did," I echoed, wrapping my arm around her. It felt surreal, like we were in the middle of a dream that we never wanted to end. Everything felt so perfect, so right, like we were destined to be together. And in that moment, I couldn't imagine anything ever going wrong. We spent the rest of the night dancing, laughing, and celebrating with the people who mattered most. Our friends gave speeches, our families toasted to our future, and by the end of the night, we were both exhausted but happy. The kind of happiness that fills you up from the inside, making you feel like everything in the world is exactly as it should be. We honeymooned in Italy, spending 2 weeks exploring the winding streets of Rome, the serene beauty of Tuscany, and the romantic canals of Venice. It was everything we had dreamed of: long dinners with too much wine, afternoons spent wandering through ancient ruins, nights spent talking about our future, the life we would build together. I remember thinking, as we sat on the balcony of our hotel room one evening, watching the sunset over the city, that I had never been happier. It was the kind of beginning you read about in love stories. The perfect wedding, the perfect honeymoon, the perfect start to what I thought would be a perfect life together. But life isn't a love story, and sometimes the cracks start forming long before you notice them. In those early years, though, everything felt unshakable. We were partners, best friends, lovers, and everything in between. I had no doubt that we would grow old together, that this was it. But as I would later learn, even the strongest foundations can crumble when you least expect it. The children and the early family life. After the wedding, everything seemed to fall into place. We settled into married life so easily that it felt like the natural continuation of the way things had always been. We didn't change who we were for each other. We just blended more seamlessly into each other's lives. But the biggest shift came when we started talking about having kids. It wasn't a decision we rushed into. We spent the first couple of years after our wedding enjoying our freedom. We traveled often, sometimes on a whim. One weekend we'd be hiking in the mountains, and the next we'd be soaking up the sun on some tropical beach. Emily loved planning these spontaneous getaways, and I loved seeing the excitement in her eyes whenever she came up with a new adventure for us. It was a golden period in our relationship, those years when it felt like the world was just ours. We had no obligations, no real responsibilities. Just each other and the endless possibilities of the future. But eventually, the idea of starting a family started creeping into our conversations. It was subtle at first. Emily would point out a cute kid at the park, or we'd have dinner with friends who had recently become parents, and she'd talk about how adorable their baby was, how fun it would be to have one of our own. I wasn't against it, but I also wasn't sure if I was ready for the responsibility. Life was good as it was, and I didn't know if I wanted to disrupt that. But Emily, she was ready. She had a way of convincing me without being pushy. She'd bring it up in casual conversations, painting this picture of us as parents, our life with kids running around the house, the chaos of family life mixed with the joy of watching our little ones grow. She made it sound so beautiful, so fulfilling, that eventually, I started warming up to the idea. And one day, I realized I wanted it too. So we took the plunge. The decision to have a baby was one we made together, but it felt more like stepping into the unknown. Neither of us knew what to expect, but we were excited. We spent those early months reading every parenting book we could get our hands on, researching everything from pregnancy to raising kids. Emily threw herself into it with the same energy she brought to everything else in life, and I followed her lead. We were a team just like we had always been. When Emily told me she was pregnant, it was one of the happiest moments of my life. She had woken me up early one morning, bouncing on the bed with excitement, waving the positive pregnancy test in my face. I remember pulling her into my arms, feeling this overwhelming sense of joy and love for the woman who was now carrying our child. It was one of those moments where everything felt right, like the universe was smiling down on us, giving us exactly what we had been hoping for. The pregnancy itself wasn't without its challenges. Emily had some rough patches, morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that left her drained, but she handled it with the same determination she brought to everything else. And I did my best to support her. I went to every doctor's appointment, held her hand during the ultrasounds, and rubbed her feet after long days at work. We were in it together, and as her belly grew, so did our excitement. Our first child, a boy we named Jackson, was born on a stormy night in July. I'll never forget that night. The labor was long and difficult, and seeing Emily in pain was one of the hardest things I'd ever experienced. But she was strong, so much stronger than I ever imagined. And when Jackson finally arrived, all that pain and exhaustion melted away the moment she held him in her arms. There's nothing quite like the feeling of holding your child for the first time. It's a mix of awe, fear, and love so intense that it almost knocks you over. I looked at him, this tiny, perfect little person, and I knew my life had just changed forever. Emily looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I knew she felt the same. We were parents now. Our world had shifted, and there was no going back. The early days of parenthood were a blur of sleepless nights and diaper changes, but we adapted. It wasn't easy, but we found a new rhythm. Emily was a natural mother, nurturing, patient, and somehow always knowing exactly what Jackson needed. I, on the other hand, was a bit more awkward at first, but I learned quickly, and with Emily by my side, we figured it out together. A couple of years later, we welcomed our second child, a little girl named Avery. She was the polar opposite of Jackson. Where Jackson had been calm and easygoing, Avery was a firecracker from the start, always full of energy, always demanding attention. But she brought a new light into our lives, and watching her grow alongside her brother made everything feel complete. Our third child, Mason, came a few years after Avery. By then, we were seasoned parents, or at least we thought we were. Mason was another surprise, a last-minute addition to our family that we hadn't exactly planned for, but welcomed all the same. He was the quiet one, always observing, taking in the world with wide, curious eyes. And just like that, we had our little family. 3 kids, a house filled with laughter and sometimes chaos, and a life that felt full. In those early years, everything revolved around the kids. Our lives became a series of routines: school drop-offs, soccer practices, playdates, birthday parties. Emily and I worked like a well-oiled machine, dividing up the responsibilities and keeping everything running smoothly. It wasn't always easy, but we made it work. We were partners in every sense of the word. But looking back now, I can see how that shift, the shift from being a couple to being parents, started to change things between us. Our conversations were mostly about the kids, about schedules, about who would handle what. The romance, the spontaneity, the connection we once had seemed to take a back seat to the demands of family life. At the time, I didn't notice it much. I was too busy trying to keep up with everything, and Emily seemed fine with how things were. We were happy, or so I thought. We still loved each other, of course. That was never in question. But the passion we had in the early days, the late-night talks, the adventures, the stolen moments of intimacy, started to fade. It wasn't that we didn't try to keep the spark alive. We had date nights when we could, weekends away from the kids when our parents offered to babysit. But even then, it was like we were just going through the motions. The excitement, the thrill of being together had dulled. I figured it was just part of growing older, part of settling into the routine of family life. Emily, though, had always been someone who craved excitement. She wasn't the type to sit still for long, and while I was content with our life as it was, I didn't see that she wasn't. She needed more adventure, more freedom, more of the spark that had once defined us. And as much as I loved her, I didn't see that she was starting to look for that excitement elsewhere. For years, we were a team, and I thought that would be enough. But as I would soon find out, sometimes love and routine aren't enough to keep everything together. The drift and the nightlife. Looking back, I guess the signs were always there. But when you're in the middle of it, when you're knee-deep in raising kids, juggling work, and trying to keep your head above water, it's easy to miss what's right in front of you. Life had become a routine for us, a series of predictable events that we cycled through day after day. I thought that was just how things were supposed to be. Comfortable, maybe a little dull, but stable. Safe. Emily, though, she wasn't built for comfortable or predictable. She had always been someone who thrived on excitement, someone who needed a little chaos to feel alive. At first, I thought that having kids and settling into family life would be enough for her. But as the years went on, I started to notice a change in her. Subtle at first, like the way she'd get restless during our quiet evenings at home. She'd complain about being tired from work, but her eyes would flicker with a kind of energy, like she was waiting for something more to happen, something that never came. Started small. She began going out with friends more often, at first once a month, then every couple of weeks. I didn't think much of it. She needed her space, time to herself away from the chaos of kids and family life. I figured it was healthy. I even encouraged her to have her me time to enjoy herself. But soon, the nights out became more frequent, the excuses more creative. At first, it was happy hours with her coworkers, team-building events, late meetings, networking dinners. At least, that's what she told me. And why wouldn't I believe her? Emily had always been ambitious, always focused on her career. She was the kind of person who'd stay late at the office because she truly wanted to get things done, to prove herself. I had no reason to doubt her. If anything, I was proud of her. But then, things started to feel off. It was little things at first. She'd come home later than usual, her clothes smelling faintly of alcohol and perfume. Sometimes she'd be wearing a different outfit than the one she left the house in, claiming she had changed after work to go straight to a bar with her coworkers. She'd stumble in, just a little tipsy, her smile too bright, her laugh a little too carefree. I asked her about it once, jokingly, "Did you guys really have that many meetings at the bar?" She laughed it off, brushed her hand through my hair, and kissed me on the cheek. "Don't worry, it's just work stuff. You know how it is." But I didn't know. And the more she brushed off my questions, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way she'd come alive when she talked about these outings, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. And when she was home, she seemed disconnected, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else, even when she was sitting right next to me. The kids didn't seem to notice. To them, everything was normal. They still had their mom around, still had their routines, and Emily was careful to make sure nothing disrupted that. She was still a great mother, still attentive and loving with them. But with me, things had shifted. We had drifted so far apart that I didn't even know where to begin pulling us back together. I didn't want to believe the worst. I didn't want to think that Emily could be cheating on me. After all, we had been through so much together. We had built a life, a family. She loved me, didn't she? I told myself that this was just a phase, a midlife crisis or something. She was restless, sure, but that didn't mean she was unfaithful. But the nights out kept piling up. The lingering at work, excuses became more frequent, more vague. She'd tell me she was stuck in meetings until late, but when I asked her for details, she'd wave me off. Oh, just some boring client stuff. You wouldn't be interested. Then she'd change the subject every single time. The first real red flag came one Friday night. Emily came home, stumbling through the door, reeking of alcohol. This time, though, she was more than just tipsy. She was drunk. I'd never seen her like that before. She was always so put together, so in control, even when she drank. But that night, something was different. She giggled as she kicked off her heels, leaning against the wall for balance. Her makeup was smudged, her hair messy in a way that didn't look like the Emily I knew. I was sitting on the couch, half watching a game on TV, but my attention shifted the moment I saw her stumble in. Rough night? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my gut told me something was wrong. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she laughed again, this high-pitched, almost forced laugh that made my skin crawl. She made her way to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water and chugging it down, her hand shaking slightly as she set the glass back on the counter. "I'm fine," she finally said, her voice slurring just a little. "Just a long day. A long day." I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She was supposed to be home hours ago. "You were working until now?" She looked at me, her eyes slightly glazed over, her smile faltering for a second before she forced it back on. "Yeah, long meeting. You know how it is." There it was again. That excuse. The same one she had used 100 times before. But this time it didn't sit right with me. Something in her voice, in the way she avoided my gaze, made me feel like there was more to the story. I wanted to press her, to ask her where she really was, but I held back. Maybe it was the fear of what I might hear, or maybe I just didn't want to start a fight. Not when she was drunk. Not in front of the kids. So I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But that night, as Emily fell into a drunken sleep next to me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut, and for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily wasn't being honest with me. That was the night the doubts really started to creep in. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She was back to her usual self, attentive with the kids, chatty at breakfast, asking about my plans for the day like everything was perfectly normal. But I couldn't get the image of her stumbling through the door out of my head. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she was hiding something. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention. I asked more questions, subtle at first, trying not to seem suspicious. But her answers were always vague, always brushing off my concerns. She would say things like, "Oh, it's just been a busy time at work," or, "I'm just tired from all these meetings." The same excuses over and over again. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the doubt was there now, festering in the back of my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, it wouldn't leave me alone. So I made a decision. I needed to know the truth. I needed to find out if my gut was right, or if I was just being paranoid. I told Emily that I had to go on a business trip for a few days. It wasn't entirely a lie. There was a work conference in another city, but I arranged it in a way that gave me time to observe her without her knowing. It was time to figure out what was really going on, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might find. Uncovering the truth. I thought I could let it go. I thought that maybe I was just overreacting, that all of this was in my head. But every time Emily left for another work event, or stayed late at the office for those so-called meetings, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. The doubt had settled in, and it wasn't going anywhere. I knew something was wrong. Something bigger than just a restless wife in need of a night out. And the worst part? I didn't even know how deep it went. The morning after Emily had come home drunk, I tried to brush it off. I tried to convince myself that maybe she had just had one too many drinks with her coworkers, that it was nothing more than an innocent night out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one night. This had been building for months, maybe even longer, and I had been too blind, too trusting to see it. It wasn't just the drinking or the late nights. It was the way she had changed. The way she looked at me had shifted. Her touches, once warm and affectionate, felt distant and mechanical. The laughter we used to share had disappeared, replaced by silence or, worse, forced conversations that went nowhere. We weren't partners anymore. We were two people living under the same roof, going through the motions. I started paying more attention to the little things. Her phone, for one. She used to leave it lying around the house, unlocked and open, but now it was always in her hand or tucked into her bag. When it did ring, she'd glance at it, swipe it away, and tell me it was just work, before stepping into another room to take the call. Sometimes, when I'd walk past her while she was texting, I'd catch her closing the screen quickly, as if she didn't want me to see what was on it. Every red flag was waving in my face, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that Emily, the woman I had built a life with, could be doing this to me. But the truth was starting to become impossible to ignore. So I made a decision. I needed to know what was really going on, and the only way to find out was to follow her. I told her I had a work trip coming up, a conference out of town that would keep me away for a few days. In reality, I was staying right where I was, watching, waiting. The day came, and I packed a suitcase, kissed Emily goodbye, and left the house like I was headed to the airport. She barely glanced up from her phone when I walked out the door. Part of me wanted her to stop me, to say she'd miss me, but all I got was a distracted, "Have a good trip." That hurt more than I expected. I didn't go far. I drove around for a while, aimlessly, just trying to clear my head and figure out what I was doing. I felt sick to my stomach. Sick with the knowledge that I had to follow my own wife like some kind of spy just to get the truth out of her. But I couldn't let it go any longer. I needed to know. By the time I pulled back into the neighborhood, the sun was setting. I parked a few streets away from our house, keeping out of sight, and waited. I told myself I wouldn't jump to conclusions, that I needed concrete evidence before I let my suspicions run wild. But my heart was already pounding in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. Not long after, I saw Emily leave the house. She was dressed differently than she had been earlier, more put together, like she was going out for the night. She had a small purse slung over her shoulder, and her hair was done up in a way she didn't usually bother with unless she had a special occasion. That was my first clue that this wasn't a simple work event. I waited until she was down the street before I started the car and followed her, keeping a safe distance. My heart was racing, and every part of me was screaming to turn around, to stop this, but I couldn't. I had to know. She drove across town, stopping in front of a club I had never heard her mention before. It wasn't the kind of place Emily would usually go. It was loud, with flashing neon lights and a crowd of people lined up outside the door. As I parked a little ways down the street, I watched her get out of the car, her face glowing under the streetlights, and walk toward the entrance. And she wasn't alone. A man met her at the door, someone I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and clearly familiar with her. They greeted each other with a casual hug, the kind that spoke of more than just friendship. My blood ran cold. I had expected something, some clue that she was hiding things from me, but seeing it with my own eyes was a different kind of pain. I stayed in the car, too stunned to move. I watched as they disappeared into the club, the doors swinging shut behind them, leaving me sitting there in the dark, my mind spinning. What was I supposed to do now? I could storm in there, confront her, demand answers in front of everyone. But what good would that do? It would be a scene, a disaster, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I waited. I sat in that car for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it all been a lie? Had our entire marriage been nothing more than a facade? A carefully constructed image of happiness while she carried on with someone else behind my back? Eventually, the doors to the club opened again, and Emily came out, arm in arm with the same man. They were laughing, stumbling a little as if they'd had more than a few drinks. My stomach twisted in knots, and I had to fight the urge to throw the car into gear and drive away. But I stayed, watching them get into a car together and drive off into the night. I followed them again, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. They drove across town, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a hotel. That was when the full weight of reality hit me. They were having an affair. There was no more doubt, no more uncertainty. I had seen it with my own eyes. I watched as they walked into the hotel, Emily's arm around the man's waist, his hand resting on her lower back in a way that made my skin crawl. The doors closed behind them, and I was left sitting in my car, watching the lights of the hotel flicker in the distance. I should have done something. I should have stormed in there, demanded an explanation, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the betrayal. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was in there with another man. And there was nothing I could do about it. I drove home that night in a daze, my mind numb with shock and disbelief. I didn't sleep, couldn't. The image of them together was burned into my brain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. When Emily came home the next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She was cheerful, telling me about her long night at work, and I sat there, barely able to look at her, wondering how long she had been lying to me, how long she had been living this double life. I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. It was time for answers, whether she was ready to give them or not. The confrontation. The next few days were unbearable. I went through the motions of life like a robot, doing what needed to be done but feeling nothing inside. I kept replaying the moment I saw Emily with that man. How easily she had laughed with him, how comfortable they seemed together. It was as if she had two separate lives, and I was stuck in the one where I was nothing more than a background character. I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. The weight of what I'd seen was crushing me, and I knew that if I didn't confront her soon, it would tear me apart. The hardest part was acting like nothing had changed. She came home every night, chatting about her day, acting like everything was normal, while I sat there, barely able to meet her eyes. I was planning how to break it to her, how to finally force the truth out of her. On the surface, she seemed oblivious, but there was something different about her, something more guarded. Maybe she could sense the tension in me, or maybe she was just good at pretending. Either way, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to hear her say it. I needed to know the truth. One evening, just after the kids had gone to bed, I decided it was time. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a suffocating blanket. Emily was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open, supposedly finishing up some work. I watched her from the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest, every muscle in my body tense. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed to stick in my throat. "Emily," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. She looked up, surprised, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Yeah." I took a deep breath, feeling the anger and betrayal swell inside me. "We need to talk." Her expression changed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "Okay, about what?" I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I wasn't sure how to start, but I couldn't hold back any longer. "I know." Her eyes narrowed, confusion crossing her face. "Know what?" It took everything I had to keep my voice steady. "I know about the clubs. I know about the man you've been meeting. I know you've been lying to me." For a second, just a split second, I saw her mask slip. Her eyes widened in shock before she quickly composed herself. But it was too late. I had seen the truth. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice too calm, too controlled. "You're being ridiculous." I felt my fists clench at my sides, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Don't lie to me, Emily. I followed you. I saw you with him. I saw you go into that hotel with him." The silence that followed was suffocating. She sat there, frozen, her face pale. For a moment I thought she might deny it again, that she might try to twist her way out of it like she had with everything else. But instead, she closed her eyes, letting out a slow, shaky breath. "Okay," she said softly. "You're right." Her admission hit me like a punch to the gut. Even though I had known the truth for days, hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I had known was crumbling into dust. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been seeing him?" She didn't look at me. She stared down at the table, her hands folded in her lap. "A few months," she said quietly. "It started last November." "Months?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You've been lying to me for months?" She nodded, still not meeting my gaze. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the woman I had married. The woman sitting in front of me was a stranger, someone who had lied to me for months, someone who had torn apart everything we had built together. The anger in me was rising, but so was the pain, the crushing, suffocating pain of betrayal. "So all those nights you said you were working late? The meetings? The happy hours with your coworkers? Those were all lies." My voice shook, my hands trembling as I tried to hold myself together. Emily finally looked at me, her eyes filled with regret. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" I scoffed, shaking my head in disbelief. "You're sorry? That's all you have to say after everything you've done?" Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. But I wasn't ready to forgive her. I wasn't ready to feel sympathy for her. All I could feel was the raw, searing pain of betrayal. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "You hurt me. You lied to me, Emily. You cheated on me, and you didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. I had to follow you like some kind of spy just to find out what was really going on." She wiped at her eyes, sniffling as she tried to hold herself together. "I was lost," she said quietly. "I didn't know how to stop. I've been feeling trapped, like we've lost something between us." "Trapped?" I repeated, anger flaring again. "You feel trapped, so you just go and screw someone else behind my back? That's your solution." "It wasn't like that," she pleaded. "It's not like I planned this. It just happened. I got caught up in everything. The excitement, the escape. I didn't know how to stop." I stared at her, unable to believe the words coming out of her mouth. "So, that's it? You wanted excitement, so you found it with him? You decided that our life, our family, wasn't enough for you?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. "No, it's not that. I love you. I love our family. I don't know what happened. I felt like I was drowning in routine, in the same thing day after day, and I didn't know how to handle it. And then I met him, and for a little while, I felt like I could breathe again." Her words cut through me like a knife. I had heard enough. The excuses, the justifications, it all sounded like hollow noise to me. I felt like I was suffocating, my chest tight with rage and sorrow. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. "I can't do this right now," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't even look at you." She reached out to me, her hand trembling. "Please, let me explain." "No," I snapped, stepping back. "There's nothing more to explain, Emily. You've said enough." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room. I couldn't stand to be near her. I felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the house we had built together was suffocating me. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to get out before I said something I couldn't take back. I left the house that night, driving aimlessly through the dark streets, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The betrayal, the lies, the way she had tried to justify it all. It was too much to process. I didn't know what to do, where to go from here. I had trusted her. I had built a life with her. And now it felt like everything was falling apart. By the time I got home, the house was dark. Emily had gone to bed, or at least she was pretending to. I didn't go upstairs. couldn't. Instead, I grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where our life had once been. The explosion. The days following the confrontation were some of the hardest of my life. We barely spoke. Emily stayed mostly in the bedroom or took long walks, probably to avoid me. I spent most of my time in the living room, drinking more than I should, staring blankly at the TV or scrolling through my phone, searching for answers where none existed. The weight of everything sat heavy in the house, like a storm waiting to break, and I knew it was only a matter of time before things came crashing down for good. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave, to run far away from the mess my life had become. But another part of me, maybe the weaker, more pathetic part, wanted to stay to fight for the life we had built, even though it was obvious that it was already gone. I didn't know how to be without her, even after everything she had done. The nights were the worst. The silence in the house was suffocating, and the loneliness felt like it was eating me alive. I'd hear her moving around upstairs, sometimes softly crying, sometimes nothing at all, and I hated that part of me still cared. That part of me still wanted to go to her, to ask her why, to beg for an answer that would make this all make sense. But there was no answer that could fix this. No explanation that would make the betrayal go away. One night, a week after I had confronted her, Emily came home late again. This time it was worse. She wasn't just drunk. She was stumbling, her speech slurred, and she reeked of cheap alcohol. Worse than that, though, she wasn't alone. I heard the door slam shut and her giggling, followed by another voice. Another woman's voice. I froze where I was sitting on the couch, the whiskey glass in my hand halfway to my lips. My heart sank, knowing that whatever was about to happen wasn't good. The familiar knot of anger and hurt twisted in my gut, but I stayed where I was, listening. Footsteps shuffled down the hall, and I could hear them laughing. Emily and this other woman. The laughter was different, almost flirtatious, like two people who had shared a secret. My jaw clenched as I set the glass down on the table, trying to process what the hell was going on. The door to the living room swung open, and there she was, Emily, with that same reckless smile I had seen too many times before. But this time she wasn't alone. Standing next to her, grinning just as wildly, was Haley, her friend. Haley and Emily had been close for years, but I had never seen them like this. Both of them clearly drunk, leaning on each other for support, their giggles filling the room. The sight of them together in that state made my blood boil. "Hey, babe," Emily slurred, stumbling into the room. "Look who's here." Haley waved, her eyes glazed over from too much alcohol. "We thought we'd have a little fun," she added, her voice dripping with a playful tone that set me on edge. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It wasn't just that Emily had brought someone home with her. It was the look in their eyes, the way they moved together, like they were in on something that I wasn't. I felt like an outsider in my own home, like I was watching something that was spiraling completely out of control. "What the hell is going on?" I asked, my voice barely masking the fury that had been simmering for days. Emily shrugged, a drunken smile still plastered on her face. "We're just having a little fun," she said, stumbling toward me. "Haley wanted to come over, so I brought her." I stood up, my fists clenched at my sides. "Fun," I spat, barely able to contain my rage. "You call this fun? After everything you've done, after everything you've lied about, you bring her here? Like this?" Haley took a step closer, her voice soft and smooth, like she was trying to calm me down. "Hey, it's no big deal. We just wanted to hang out. Unwind." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife was drunk, standing in front of me with another woman, and they were acting like this was some kind of game. Like none of what had happened mattered. Emily swayed on her feet, her eyes glazed over, and suddenly, she laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that cut through the air like a knife. "Why do you care?" she slurred, the words tumbling out of her mouth with venom. "You've been ignoring me for days. It's not like you care what I do anymore." The anger I had been holding back finally snapped. "I don't care," I growled, stepping toward her, my fists clenched at my sides. I care because you've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking around, seeing someone behind my back, and now you want to act like I'm the one who doesn't care." Emily blinked, her drunken haze momentarily lifting as my words hit her. But instead of backing down, she laughed again, this time more bitterly. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice mocking. "You're not so innocent either. You think I don't see the way you look at Haley? You think I don't know you've thought about it?" The room seemed to go still. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I glanced at Haley, who was watching me intently, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Emily," I warned, my voice low, but she wasn't listening anymore. "You want her, don't you?" Emily continued, stumbling closer to me, her face inches from mine. "Why don't you just admit it? You've been looking for an excuse to leave, to find someone else. Well, here's your chance." She was taunting me, daring me to cross a line that had already been blurred beyond recognition. And Haley? She wasn't helping. She was just standing there, watching it all unfold, like she was waiting for something to happen. I should have walked away. I should have left the room, left the house, anything to avoid what was coming next. But I didn't. I was too angry, too hurt, and maybe part of me wanted to prove her right. Maybe part of me wanted to hurt her the way she had hurt me. Haley took a step closer, her hand resting on my arm, her touch soft and teasing. "It's okay," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. "We're all just having a little fun, right?" I looked at Emily, then back at Haley. My heart was pounding, my head spinning. Everything was a blur of emotions. Anger, betrayal, lust, confusion. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I cared anymore. And then, in a moment of weakness, of pure, reckless abandonment, I let go. I let the anger and the alcohol take over. I let Haley pull me in, her lips finding mine in a kiss that I didn't stop. I didn't push her away. I didn't tell her no. I let it happen. Emily watched, her expression unreadable. Maybe she didn't care anymore either. Maybe this was exactly what she wanted. The rest of the night was a haze of bad decisions, blurred lines, and mistakes that couldn't be undone. I don't know how it happened, how it all escalated, but the three of us became tangled in something dark, something that wasn't about love or affection anymore. It was about pain, inflicting it, receiving it, losing ourselves in it. The boundaries of our marriage, our lives, were shattered that night, as I crossed the line I had sworn I would never cross. When it was over, when the house was quiet again, and the alcohol had worn off, I sat alone on the couch, staring at the floor. Emily and Haley were asleep upstairs, and the weight of everything I had done came crashing down on me. I had become the very thing I had hated her for being. I had let myself fall into the same trap, the same lies. I had destroyed everything. A week later, Emily and I separated for good. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye. There were no tears, no last-ditch efforts to save what had already been lost. We both knew it was over. We had known for a long time. The kids were the hardest part. Explaining it to them, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all, was gut-wrenching. But even they could see the cracks in the foundation, and though they were hurt, they weren't surprised. Emily moved out first, taking the kids with her, and I stayed behind in the house that no longer felt like home. The silence that followed was suffocating, but in some strange way, it was a relief. The storm had passed, and I was left standing in the wreckage. A few months later, I married Haley. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, not like it had been with Emily. It was quieter, more calculated. She knew what I had been through, and somehow, we found comfort in each other's brokenness. But even as I stood at the altar, reciting my vows to Haley, a part of me wondered if I had ever really stopped loving Emily. If part of me always would. After the storm, the days after the separation felt like I was living in some kind of slow-motion haze. It was as if everything around me had dulled. The sounds, the colors, even the way the sunlight filtered through the windows of the house we had once shared. That house. It no longer felt like mine, like it belonged to me. Every corner of it held memories, ghosts of a life that had crumbled so fast it felt impossible to comprehend. Emily had moved out a week after our final blowout, taking the kids with her. We agreed it was for the best. The house was too full of tension, too filled with reminders of everything we had lost. She was surprisingly calm about it all, almost indifferent, as if she had already accepted that our marriage was beyond saving. In a way, maybe she had. Maybe she'd made peace with it long before I ever did. Our conversations after the separation were short, emotionless. They revolved around the kids, how they were adjusting, how the new living arrangements would work, who would get them for the holidays. We treated it like a business transaction, exchanging details like we were signing a contract rather than dismantling a marriage. But that was the only way we could do it. There was too much pain, too much anger between us to handle it any other way. The kids were hurt, of course, but they were stronger than I had expected. Maybe they had seen it coming, sensed the distance between their parents before we ever admitted it to ourselves. Jackson, my oldest, was the one who asked the tough questions. "Why are you and Mom not together anymore?" he asked one night during one of his visits. His voice was so soft, so full of confusion, that it nearly broke me. I didn't have an answer, not a real one, not one that could make sense to a child. I told him what all parents say in these situations, something about how adults sometimes grow apart, how it wasn't his fault or his siblings. He nodded like he understood, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't. And how could he? I barely understood it myself. The next few months were quiet, too quiet. Emily had taken the kids to live with her parents temporarily while she figured out a more permanent place. I stayed in the house, alone with my thoughts, the silence unbearable at times. The guilt of that final night, the night with Haley, gnawed at me constantly. I had let everything spiral out of control. I had crossed a line I swore I would never cross, and now I was paying the price for it. But life doesn't stop. Even in the aftermath of disaster, time marches forward. And slowly I started to rebuild. Haley became more present in my life, at first just as a friend, a comforting presence in the chaos. She had always been close with Emily, and I think in some twisted way, that made it easier for both of us to fall into something together. We understood the mess, the broken pieces of each other's lives. It wasn't a grand love story. It wasn't the whirlwind romance I had experienced with Emily. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe I didn't need another story filled with passion and drama. Haley was steady, reliable, and she understood me in ways that surprised me. She didn't ask for much, didn't push. She just stayed. The first time I brought her to the house, it felt strange. Wrong, even. The same house where Emily and I had built a life together, where our kids had grown up, was now hosting someone new. But Haley didn't seem to mind. She made herself comfortable in a way that Emily never had. There was no grand seduction, no attempt to replace what had been lost. Just a quiet, mutual understanding that we were both starting over and that maybe, just maybe, we could help each other do that. Our relationship grew from there, not because of some overwhelming love, but because we were two people who had been broken by life and found solace in each other's company. We had both been part of Emily's world, and now we were making a new one. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And then, one day, Haley asked me something I hadn't expected. It was during one of our quiet nights at home, sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees. She turned to me, her expression serious in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. I didn't need to ask what she meant. The night with Emily. The night that had torn everything apart. I thought about it for a moment, letting the question sink in. Did I regret it? Did I regret what had happened with Emily? The affair, the lies, the betrayal, both hers and mine? I regret a lot of things, I said finally, my voice quiet. But I don't know if I regret it all. I think some things were going to happen no matter what. Maybe we were always headed here, one way or another. Haley nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't say anything, but I knew she understood. She had been part of this story, too. She had seen it unravel from the inside. A year after the separation, Haley and I got married. It wasn't the grand affair that my wedding with Emily had been. It was small, quiet, just a few close friends and family. The kids were there, of course, though they seemed more confused than anything. They had barely adjusted to the idea that their parents were no longer together, and now here I was marrying someone else. But we did our best to make it work. We were doing the best we could. The ceremony was simple. No grand vows, no sweeping declarations of love. Just a quiet promise to each other that we would try, that we would do our best to make this new life work. As I stood there, holding Haley's hands, looking into her eyes, I couldn't help but think back to Emily. Part of me would always think about her. Part of me would always wonder what could have been different, what could have been saved. But I knew, deep down, that this was where I was supposed to be now. With Haley, starting over. After the wedding, life fell into a new kind of normal. The kids adjusted, slowly but surely, to the idea of having two homes, two families. They were resilient, stronger than I had ever been. And while I knew that my relationship with Emily would never be the same, we found a way to be civil for the sake of the kids. We co-parented as best we could, trying to keep the remnants of our family intact, even if we were no longer the center of it. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the house was still, I would think back to the beginning. To that cold December night when I first saw Emily in that coffee shop, when everything felt so simple, so full of possibility. I would think about the life we had built together, the love we had shared, and how it had all fallen apart in ways neither of us could have predicted. But life doesn't stop. It moves forward, relentlessly, whether you're ready for it or not. And as the years passed, I learned to accept that. To accept the choices I had made, the mistakes that had led me here. To accept that sometimes, things break beyond repair. But even in the wreckage, new things can grow. Haley and I built a life together, not perfect, but good, steady. And in the end, maybe that's all I had ever really needed.